reflecting back. But first bit of the podcast was it felt slower and more methodical, right? And then we started talking about some of the various elements and aspects towards the last half, or however long it's been, and it like picked up, and there was like more to it, and there was more aspiration of thought there. Welcome to the Excellence in Enterprise podcast, where I reach out to people I do not know, engage with friends, all for the purpose of learning about them, learning about what they care about, why they care about what they're doing, what they're engaged with, from across multiple different industries and multiple different vantage points and viewpoints, all for the purpose of increasing my personal knowledge and kind of thinking outside the box when it comes to my work, my professional career. I want to draw from those sources, and I thought you might be interested in hearing as well. So I hope you will join me on this journey. You can find me on YouTube, on Spotify, on Instagram, and on Twitter. Feel free to reach out anytime. I'd love to engage with you. And I hope you enjoyed this podcast interview engagement journey with me. Welcome back to episode 6 of the Excellence in Enterprise podcast. This is my friend Micah Meadowcroft. He and I have known each other since, technically since we were babies, though, of course, neither of us remember that. Our mothers knew each other long before we came around. And so it has been a long journey, though an interesting one, because while we've known each other and been connected for a really long time, we haven't always been in like constant communication. And so it's been one of those, from my perspective, one of those relationships and friendships that's like, you can relatively easily pick up kind of right where you left off. And that's kind of happened recently because Micah went to Hillsdale College, and I'll let him tell you more about this in his own words, but he went to Hillsdale College while I was at Patrick Henry College. And then he was in the DC area for a little bit, and then he moved to Chicago to get his master's, and I stayed in the DC area. But he's back in the DC area, and he recently took on an interesting job. And one of the reasons that I wanted, I guess the main reason, at least for this episode, that I wanted to bring Micah on is because he's been on an interesting changing trajectory in kind of his professional career and how he's considered that and how he's kind of considered his role towards his career and like what he wants to be doing. And I thought that would be helpful for all of us, mostly because I too have had that struggle, and I know what a struggle it can be for people that are kind of considering that. And I thought maybe he could help us think through or give us wisdom as to, mistakes not to make. And then, I think also then being a great example of a story of where it's okay to make changes as you go, which I think is one of the scary things that is typically one of the issues when people are considering making changes or dealing with changing priorities and changing interests over time. So, Micah, to start us off, why don't you give a little bit of a background, kind of where you've come from and like what you kind of got to prior to your changing trajectory, and then we can talk more about that more specifically.
Sure, I'll try to outline everything. Thanks for having me on. So yes, our mothers. Let's see. I think your mother was my mother's maid of honor in my parents' wedding. So there's the nature of that connection. And you're right. I think we're both very intensely present. Well, you're more intensely present, I think. I am a little more future focused, but you're kind of present focused people. And so, yeah, when we tend to be where we are and lose track of people when we're not with them, but we get to pick things back up when we're with each other again. And that's been really a pleasure to do that again recently. And so, yes, so as you said, we knew each other growing up. From the Pacific Northwest as well. If you guys don't know, Britton's from Oregon. I'm from Washington State. It was about a kind of 2.5 hour, 3 hour drive to visit each other a few times as kids. I went to Hillsdale College in Michigan, where I studied history and minored in journalism. And after that, I kind of defaulted to being I had an undergrad thought that I would be an academic, but I'd also thought that I would be an actor and get involved in movie making. So there was a lot of things going on. And then I'd happened to developed the only kind of professionally employable skills that I developed in college were journalism related ones. I had worked on the school paper for all 4 years of my undergrad experience. I'd really enjoyed being part of the journalism program, and that's where my internships had been and things like that. So I ended up defaulting to that and coming out to DC after a little intensive kind of continued journalism education program that I did in Philadelphia the summer after graduating, and bounced around a little bit. Was briefly on your couch, Britain. That was a good time. I think I'm a pretty easy house guest, but you were very patient nonetheless for a long time. Though I did help with the rent, so that makes it easier.
Which was appreciated,
So that was, I had kind of my nomadic. I was just trying to figure out if this journalism thing was going to work. It scared my brother off. He'd initially been also planning to be a kind of journalist, and now he's in business. So that was smart on his part. So then my longest stint here in DC the first time was 2 years at the Washington Free Beacon as an associate, first assistant editor and then as an associate editor. And I would characterize that season as just trying to get to know the city and getting to know what was possible for a young person like me here in DC, affiliated with conservative politics and also with kind of intellectual pretensions. And so that was a great perch from which to do that kind of exploration. This is all pre-COVID, so it's kind of a lost world of, there was always a lecture to go to. There's always some sort of mixer almost every evening. And if you were the kind of person who enjoyed holding forth on random academic and kind of literary topics, DC was a great town to be in. At a certain point, two things happened. I realized that the academy was still of interest to me, and was trying to figure out if that was what I should do. And I was also beginning to grow a little frustrated with what felt like a very empty career trajectory that I was on. I was writing some stuff I was really proud of, but I tended to be writing for other writers. So it was a lot of book reviews and culture criticism and kind of arts and letters stuff. And I still am proud of that stuff, but I think the career path that it seemed to be setting me up for felt not necessarily superficial, because it was dealing with the deepest questions of human nature and truth and beauty and goodness, but I wasn't sure that it wasn't parasitic or something. And then there was something that I felt more honest about the academy. It was a bit of, if I was doing this anyway, perhaps I should go be a teacher and get the credential, the kind of the license to teach that is the PhD now. There was also the feeling that I could get too comfortable too quickly. I was beginning to achieve not success, but first and second promotions and things like that, and was doing pretty well for my age. And so there was certainly the feeling that I was about to cross some sort of invisible threshold in which going back to school would feel like too big of a jump, especially financially, but also just culturally. I think DC is definitely a town you specialize for. And the longer you're here, the more specialized you are for it. So yeah, I made my applications various places, and I was very grateful in retrospect. At the time, I wasn't sure what to make of it. To not make it into any of the PhD programs that I had hoped to enter. I was going to study political theory. But I did receive an acceptance from a one-year master's program at the University of Chicago. Now, those are usually considered, for good reason, very expensive library cards or kind of cash cows. They're a way to fleece academic aspirants like myself. I fortunately was blessed to receive enough funding through the school to make it work and justify it. And I just really wanted to test the waters. And that seemed like a great opportunity, a one-year program, get a master's degree out of it. So it seemed very feasible. And I was very grateful I'm very glad I did it. So yeah, I went to the University of Chicago for a year, studying technically the degree is the MA program in social sciences. And I wrote my thesis on and kind of focused my coursework on political theory. So that was a mix of philosophy and international relations and a couple of other things, essentially. And I went in probably 80% sure that I wanted to be an academic. And I've departed now 80% sure I do not. So I think about halfway through my time at Chicago, I sort of realized that the stakes felt even more made up in some sense. Despite the the significance of what the institution is doing in training the next generation, as a graduate student, it felt very artificial and detached from anything meaningful. And there's some wild statistics about kind of like mental health in the academy and the number of graduate students who have serious mental health crises, anxiety issues. And I'd had friends who had told me about that, who were in PhD programs and had said, oh, it's real. And like, I have, low grade anxiety all the time or whatever. And I kind of thought, well, you're sort of high strung. Like that's understandable. I wouldn't have that in your position. But I think I was only there for a year. So I think I got a bit of a glimpse of the ways in which you get wrapped up in the academy in these, you lose perspective and these things become all consuming, and you have dreams of your teeth falling out and when you can sleep, and otherwise you're not able to sleep, and all sorts of crazy things. So for me, it was, the gym was what kept me sane in grad school. And I was beginning to realize like, oh wow, without these workouts, like everything people have said about mental health in the academy would be true for me too. So similarly to DC, like people drink a lot, things like that. There's a lot of self-medicating happening. So anyway, all that to say, I was beginning to realize that while I'd had a ton of fun and was very grateful to do it, I was ready to get back into the quote unquote real world. And so since DC was what I had been kind of specialized for, I decided to head back this way. And I had an initial thought that I might do full-time writing, work on a book project. Certain things didn't pan out related to that. And then I had been in conversation with some people in the Trump administration. And they, so some friends of mine who were lawyers inside the Trump White House basically said, you'd be a good fit, which was true, I think, and that there were some opportunities for me. And I ended up being the White House liaison at the Environmental Protection Agency for the final months of the administration. And I also got to help with some speech writing there. And that was a really remarkable experience. And it's one that is going to shape my thinking for a long time. I would say I'm probably, in some sense, continuously processing it, and will be for the next year or so, probably, before I think I probably need to be out of it for about twice as long as I was in it to have come to some final conclusions about what I really learned from it. And then I've ended up as the managing editor at the American Conservative. So this is a somewhat unexpected move for me. I had not been planning to come back to conservative media. As I think I said a few minutes ago, my concern the first time was that it felt like I was writing for other writers and that it was kind of detached from the purpose of a kind of ideological political machine like that. I think that can be true, but I think that the Trump years and the effort to develop a post-Trump Republican Party and kind of what the future of conservatism is has opened up a door for these sorts of media jobs to be more meaningful again, and not sort of a kind of navel-gazy DC project. So my hope, at least, that's why I took the job. The American Conservative is really known for two things: a resistance to adventurism abroad. It was founded to protest the invasion of Iraq and to say, before anyone else was saying it, this is a bad idea, or at least before anyone else was saying it on the right. And also, it's known for its emphasis on localism. amongst the kind of nationally recognized conservative publications, it's probably the most consistently localist brand of conservatism, or Main Street conservatism, not in the Chamber of Commerce sense, but in like small town America sense. And so as the Republican Party, or as the conservative American conservative movement broadly construed, goes through what I hope is a realignment, this seems like a great place to be at the American Conservative. And it's giving me a chance to write not just to other writers, though other writers certainly read it, but to the country a little bit, or to its readership in particular. But like, it's a magazine that gives me permission to have a really clear idea of the kind of person I'm talking to when I'm writing. And I sometimes probably am getting away from that, but it's easy as a writer to get self-indulgent and kind of write your inside jokes for your friends. But I'm trying to write for essentially our parents and our parents' friends, right? People who are countercultural for religious reasons and are building something, who recognize the need to build institutions and build parallel society, and recognize that the direction the country's going is not ideal, and are trying to do something about it. And so I see my kind of role in DC broadly construed, and for the foreseeable future, as do whatever it takes, be all things to all men, to create space for those kinds of communities, whether it's the one, around your family in Bend, or my parents' classical school. So that's sort of why I'm in DC still, because I think most people should probably go home. Like, I think the trend to send all of America's talented young people to 5 cities is pretty bad and self-defeating. And but someone's got to make sure that there's still space for rebuilding culture at the local level.
Gotcha. Okay. That was great. That was awesome. It gave me a lot of questions. Okay. So a couple clarifying questions, just to make sure that we're all on the same page when we're thinking about some of the approaches you were taking. So when you refer to the academy, are you using that as a term to describe kind of the philosophical hoity-toity, so to speak, of kind of higher education institutions from an academic standpoint, or are you using that more specifically?
Yeah, more specifically, because I think 30 years ago, the academy would have been a great choice.
Okay. And when you say the academy, you're referring to?
Yeah. So let me define that real quick. But first I'll say, like, 30 years ago, it'd been a great choice. 50 years ago, it'd been one of the most fun places to be on the planet. And before that, even more so. Like, actually, I think it's just the decline narrative is pretty clear for me on that stuff. So when I say the academy now, I don't mean academia. I don't mean getting paid to read and teach, which still sounds cool. I mean the institutional structure, now largely administrative. Universities are incredibly top heavy now, and faculty do not make up the majority of the staff, right? Most major research universities have way more, if you count grad students who are being underpaid to do most of the labor, and the bureaucracy, the administration of secretaries and sub-deans and so on and so forth. These things have become, especially the major prestigious universities, have become hedge funds with small think tanks attached to them, and then some sort of weird internship program that they call grad school.
They're their kind of own internal intellectual bureaucracies.
Yeah. And they behave, they obey all the same rules of bureaucracy that the federal government does too. There's certain kind of iron laws of how institutional culture develops and process culture develops. And people want to protect their turf, right? And maintain status. And that's become the game. So yeah, so my objection, or at least caution, I'm not going to rule it out, I know myself too well. A friend of mine calls grad school the ex-girlfriend who you can't stop thinking about. You keep wondering, maybe it'd be good to get back together. And it's like, there was a reason you broke up. You should stay broken up. But you still, you wonder. You just wonder. You had such nice moments, and you just kind of. So and the caution now extends from it doesn't do what it's supposed to do. Or at least the idea of academia that draws people to it is not the reality itself at all. And this is even getting ahead of like questions of cancel culture or political correctness or anything like that. Like that's all secondary in my mind to
yes.
It is broken institutionally first, and then those are symptoms of it. Like I think I'm inclined to take the most cynical read on all of those things, generally speaking. Most people aren't true believers. They're just in a status competition with each other in a bureaucratic environment that rewards certain kinds of histrionics. And so that's what we're seeing. And then it has trickle-down effects because these are the institutions that shape our elite class, especially elite media class, right? The academy speaks to the rest of the country via the New York Times or Fox.com or whatever, or Jezebel, or does anyone read? I don't know. I don't know what people read anymore in that direction. But it all is kind of one big structure of either status development or reputation laundering, and therefore it's high stakes because you can lose status and you can lose reputation. And so that's kind of actually why it's so warped and weird. And it is not at all the ivory tower anymore, right? It used to be this idea that like you are in a pseudo monastic way cut off from real life so that you can read about the eternal things, the permanent things, and think about these things. And the detachment was the point because that was the place to reflect. And now the detachment is just disconnect from like lived reality. And it makes itself heard a lot through its alumni in our kind of institutional establishment media complex.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's as you were talking, describing it, the first thought I had was, I think you can find common ground, right? Regardless of your political leaning, right? I think people our age in general actually can find common ground on relative to that perspective on higher education, which has been kind of in the rumblings for the last, probably at least 8 years. And I'm sure it's, not to say people weren't bringing it up before then, but I think like it even started with like some of the Silicon Valley success and stuff, right? More and more young people are saying, hey, this is kind of ridiculous. I'm not learning anything practical or helpful or substantive. And on top of that, the institutions weren't even doing a good job of making a connection between what is, and has been described, as maybe more fantastical or imaginary or philosophical or thoughtful, and communicating how substantive and important that can be in addition to the reality component. And so they weren't even they weren't bringing value in from our kind of generation's perspective in either sphere.
Right. People got lied to. They got told everyone needed to go to college and get a degree. I mean, the degree became a stand-in. I mean, there's a lot of chicken and egg components to this, right? Does the college degree emerge as universally necessary before or after high school diplomas cease to mean as much, signaling wise, right? Do high schools deteriorate after everyone starts going to college because they can, and the colleges can do the remedial work, or do the colleges become expected to do remedial work because no one's learning anything in high school? I don't know which comes first there. I don't know whether employers were tracking for college degrees just because it was an easy way to assess at a certain point, assess kind of like work ethic and intelligence, or whether it became a necessary signal for in general, like just maybe it was too hard to sort through people with high school diplomas or not. But yeah, that's totally upended the kind of the labor market well, especially because of also the expansion of low wage labor via immigration levels and things like that. You create a kind of dual you undercut the possibility of a kind of native low wage, low skill labor. So.
Yep. Okay. So if, and I'm going to circle back to this in a little bit later in terms of the big picture that I want to talk about in terms of shifting focuses, or shifting trajectories. But one of the questions kind of along that journey that I wanted to ask is if you were concerned about getting sucked into kind of the academy and the mess that it is mentally and emotionally, et cetera, right? Why are you not concerned about that happening with kind of a voluntary exposure to politics, and certainly the politics that we know today, which I think is one of the main issues that I think most people have with politics, is that it's pretty messed up. And there are very few, if any, people that can be respected in the field. And most of the people that champion a particular individual are, either lying to themselves or championing them for the sake of not, championing somebody else. And there's kind of a lack of true value, and then also kind of even veracity across the board. So I'm curious, like, why you see one versus the other path not having the same trap.
I think the problems with politics are more obvious to everyone, including the participants, which makes it slightly more honest, right? Okay. The liar who tells you he's lying to you is being honest in some sense, right? There's a meta honesty here. I do think that's one way to put it, is that there's a meta honesty to DC politics. And in particular right now, that in the consensus moments, so there was like a Bush consensus around the invasion of Iraq, there was an Obama consensus at various points, where the party establishments were both at their peak of control. And this is gross simplification. One thing you learn the longer you're involved in political conversations in DC is that they're constantly relitigating every decade seems to have repeat conversations. Yeah. We have an incredibly short national attention span. We have an incredibly short attention span here in the city as well. And so I don't want to pretend that these are all like literally historically true, but they're kind of the way people operate. It's the mental map they have, is that there was this time when politics basically looked like a live production of the West Wing TV show or something, right? That's what they thought they were doing. Mm-hmm. They thought everyone was playing nice, polite politicking, deliberation, right? And they weren't. There was an establishment, or there was, call it, an elite class, an establishment, whatever. The city it was a lot of self-dealing, it was a lot of self-serving, but there was a sort of united front, and it looked real polite and seemed, except it wasn't. Again, it's the funny simplifications, or everything's nicer in retrospect, right? Like Bush's reputation got totally whitewashed in comparison to Trump. But at the time, he was also Hitler, right? And the next guy will be Hitler too. So it's that forever. But essentially, I think that there's a degree to which the obvious dysfunction makes real reform possible. This is probably delusion. I'm probably just a misanthrope who should just go hide in a cabin in the woods or something. But there's this there's a sense in the reason I'm here in part is because the fact that everything is chaotic and weird and the seams are showing is good, right? It's not, none of this is new. It's just we're finally able to talk about it, and it's finally visible to more and more people. And as it becomes visible to more and more people, then perhaps there's an opportunity to actually exercise kind of popular sovereignty and or even just use the federal system that we have, right? States retain a certain degree of political autonomy despite all the years and years and years of centralization we've done. There seems like there are opportunities that would not be available otherwise under a more polite administration or in a less chaotic time, because the chaos is just a sign that the whole system's not in lockstep with itself right now, which means there's space to maneuver. And so, I and a bunch of other people here in this city are trying to capitalize on that. But we may be deluding ourselves and thinking that we won't just get co-opted into the existing structures. The right move may be, again, that's why I'm somewhat confident that I'm pretty confident that I'm at the right place. Like, right, the right move may be localism. The right move may be going somewhere else, building smaller institutions elsewhere. But it does seem like someone needs to fight for space. And the administrative state, or the kind of the overgrown federal bureaucracy, is a part of life now. And so is the deficit. So are a bunch of things that traditionally we're seen as the problem. And it's not to say that they haven't caused enormous problems and won't still cause enormous problems. But if you think about, say, the COVID relief bill, is it financially irresponsible to cut checks for $1,400 for most people? Probably. But that is a tiny fraction of what is essentially a corporate bailout to other parts of the national economy. And also a continuous, when was the first Gulf War? I mean, really just the Cold War. Like, we're always funneling money into the military industrial complex, into the security state. Like, these are not, the $1,400 check might be too little too late, right? Maybe we should have been sending these checks last summer. But it is a drop in the bucket compared to the other problems going on. So I think that's sort of one of the other opportunities, is that there's a certain pragmatism that comes with everything being ugly, is you can now be cynical. We're able to get rid of some of the idealism that I think got in the way of prudent statecraft.
Sure. Okay. So when you were kind of considering the shift, and obviously you have a little bit of hindsight, obviously you'll have more and more hindsight over time, but what was like the scariest, for lack of a better term, aspect of kind of deciding to make a switch from what you had planned to pursue for however many years?
Which transition in particular?
So the transition from being interested, it would have happened while you were at getting your master's in Chicago. The transition from, hey, I'm 80% sure I want to kind of go into academia and be involved and, maybe teach and that sort of thing, versus kind of actually I'm going to try and play a more active, quote unquote, realistic role in trying to shape something, through my work.
Yeah. I mean, it was actually it was relatively straightforward because it seemed to map onto what I was studying. Since I was studying political theory, and since I had begun to focus particularly on the question of human responsibility and freedom in technological society. And technology, in this sense, it's a idiosyncratic academic use. I want to include bureaucracy, the modern bureaucratic state, in that kind of technology. So like constitutional legal systems, state bureaucracies, those are all forms of technology as well, just in the same way that your computer or your phone is. that they are cybernetic control mechanisms. They're supposed to order reality for human convenience. And the problem is we've increasingly not ordered reality for human convenience. We've allowed our ordering to get kind of beyond ourselves, at scale. And then we've started to treat them like they're alien from us. And there's a certain accelerationist school of thought that says they are. Like we somehow opened a door to let through something that is sort of just technological necessity, right? Or something like that. I think that's an interesting line of thinking, especially as a Christian trying to map it on to kind of spiritual warfare. But I don't think that's true. I think that we as human beings are given sub-creator power, in our capacity as imago Dei, in the image of God. What we do, what we say matters, and we can build things that are lifelike. I don't think we're ever going to get strong AI. But all that to say, though, is it doesn't leave it might leave our control, but it doesn't leave our responsibility. And it doesn't leave our capacity. It might leave our capacity for now, right? We may have become, we may be diminished. We may have degenerated to a point at which we are outstripped by our creations. And I think that's kind of where we're at. If we look around, we've been outstripped by our economic system that we've tried to create, that was, initially, again, for human convenience, but increasingly a self-serving, self-perpetuating machine. The same is true of our government. The same is true of a lot of our computer technology, things like that. So in reflecting on all of that, the choice sort of became the academy would be a mode of writing this all out. And it could be comfortable. It's harder and harder to do well, but it's possible. Very lucky. You can win the academic lottery and get a good professorship somewhere and be taken care of. So that would have been one way to do it. But the convictions that I was increasingly coming under in all my reading and research and writing, thinking about these things, was that until it becomes clear who has power and responsibility over these things, people just need to try to take it, right? The people who are convicted of the need for human responsibility are going to then have to accrue the power to exercise that responsibility. And I'm just a writer. I'm not in a position to, I don't accrue things that look like power to most people. I'm not going to be wealthy. I'm not like in charge of anything, but it's an opportunity to remind people that they are positioned somewhere with some kind of power, or at least power and responsibility are reciprocal to each other. And so whichever one they recognize themselves as having, they need to take up the other one. So, and I think generally speaking right now, we have plenty of power, but it's on the loose, right? No one's taking responsibility for it. And so the kind of pressing need civilizationally is for the people who recognize the problem to take the wheel, because right now no one's driving.
Okay. So in your role and kind of with where you're sitting today and having, kind of recently taken, well, I guess very recently, taken on this new managing editor role, what are the things that you obviously there's always unexpected, but what are the things that you expect to learn from your position and through being on at least the current path that you're on and will be on for the, foreseeable 2, 3, 4, 5, however many year future?
I think this role and the community that it embeds me in further, I was already sort of in it, which is why the role kind of came to me, is the chance to see if the rethinking can be done quickly. right? If a political solution, a DC centric solution is possible. Um, so the question on everyone's mind is if there are enough committed, driven people who agree on enough over the next 4 to 8 years and are spread out throughout the city in interesting nodes and can kind of both execute certain policy ideas, but also provide the intellectual basis for that, think through the things that, think through the questions that we're approaching, and give people frameworks within which to assess their own policy work, but also sell things, right? Rhetoric is not, there's philosophy and then there's rhetoric, sophistry, right? They're both there. There's the seeking the truth, and then there's also the selling what's needed to be sold. Speaking beautifully for the public. So I think what I feel, at least, that the kind of thing to be learned is right now is just how much can be done, how soon. I'm sorry, that's probably not, you were probably thinking specifically about the role itself, and the role itself is stuff I've done before, right? Editing, managing writers, like those are all things that are pretty straightforward and don't change much from context to context. So I don't think that that's kind of the growth area. The growth area is more what can one particular magazine and a few editors at that magazine do in concert with people on Capitol Hill, people in a think tank over there, people in a university over there. And what is that platoon, to use the little platoon, to use the Edmund Burke phrase, or just what is that kind of symposium of friends, right? A conspiracy of friendship, right? What can that accomplish? And at the scale, right? At a DC scale, that's the question. And who knows? We're probably all just deluding ourselves, but it's a lot more fun than thinking nothing can be done.
This is true. So, yes, if you have read 1984, this is true. Okay. So you and the group that sounds more intense than it is, but you and the connections and the conversations that you are having with a variety of different people and a variety of different contexts, all in a kind of general pursuit of what you've been describing in terms of having a conservative, but I think even better, a wholesome impact on where one can on the political scene, and I think on which is to say the cultural scene at large as well, right? That's kind of the perspective and and I don't mean this pejoratively, but like the bubble that you are existing within, right? And that you are running within and running towards. For those of for people, and for young listeners or old listeners, right? For the people that exist outside of that bubble, right? Which is not to say they don't care about what's going on, right? They're just as likely to be equally impassioned by a news article or something that has been brought to their attention through social media, or something their friends told them. Like, I think one of the things that at least has been expressed, whether that's only because it's amplified due to social media or not, is kind of neither here nor there in some ways, because it causes impact and change on a societal level, right? So, which is going back to it, people are impassioned, right? So for those people that don't exist inside this bubble, right, and they're working their tech jobs, they're working their engineering jobs, they're working their marketing jobs, they're working like whatever it is, right? They're pursuing their life, and they still have this passion as a function of their existence as a citizen in the world that we live in today. What are the things that you would say to them? And I would say this irrespective of, and I would like to ask this irrespective of political leaning, which I think
Right.
gets us into trouble all the time unnecessarily, right? So like, what are the things that you would ask of them in the I don't know if management's the right term, but in the overseeing of their passion and their engagement with, this bubble, so to speak, as a topic as a function of their daily and or weekly lives. What are the things, like, how should they be thinking about it? What are the wholesome and healthy ways from your perspective uh, that the rest of us should be engaging with these topics, right? And I think that's a really important question, because I think that is what dictates long term or even substantive change, and which is to say hopefully progress in some trajectory or another. But what would what would you ask of them as they consider these things? What would you say to them? you know and I say ask because I think that you need them, right? So that's why I'm phrasing it
Yeah,
that way.
I would say first I'd summarize the project insofar as there is a unified one as the recognition that our systems should amplify the human person, humanity, not overshadow it. So I think for people working within what, from my perspective, looks like the peripheries of the system, but I'm sure have their own nodes of centralized power. Certainly San Francisco does, things like that. They should look around themselves and ask, where is the human person being affirmed in this, and where is the human person being upended from its place? Where is human dignity being suppressed? And there are the really obvious ways, right? Like slave labor in the developing world, but there's also less obvious ways, like, well, pretty obvious still too, like wage slavery in an Amazon factory, where they, instead of giving you a raise, they gamify the factory system. So you get fake points for having loaded boxes faster. But then even people making a lot of money, or no one ever thinks they make a lot of money. That's the stupid thing about America. Everyone pretends to be middle class. But even people who are doing very well for themselves in a kind of high value part of the country can ask themselves this question, like, looking around, where am I participating in a system that is ignoring people's humanity, and how are ways in which I can make sure that human beings are taking responsibility for those structures of power? And what kind of power am I wielding myself, right? What do I have authority over? And am I exercising authority, or am I simply allowing myself to be a cog in the machine, in the larger machine? Because you need to exercise authority, right? You need to author, you need to assert your own human dignity in your relationship with other human beings, as opposed to yourself just being like, you dehumanize yourself when you're dehumanizing the person that you are in some sort of power relationship with. And so that's true of managers. That's true of, if you work in software, and let's say you're developing apps, and most kind of seems like a lot of digital tech right now is based on the attention economy and how much it can manipulate viewers into like maintaining eyes on ads, because we have a opt-out internet system. That's just a question to ask yourself, right? Are you comfortable with that? I think JD Vance likes to talk about how some of the best neurologists in the world work for Facebook and Google on making sure people can just want to keep scrolling. That's an obvious question about whether that's a good use of their attention and brain power to do that, to steal everyone else's attention and brain power. But an equally interesting one is like, how much of coding is cleaning up someone else's spaghetti code? And then what are you even cleaning up that spaghetti code for, right? Is the final product something that amplifies humanity, or is it something that sort of diminishes us further into kind of consumer zombies that just perpetuate? Big line goes up, GDP, yay, cool, whatever.
Okay, so the challenge to that comes to mind,
please
is
lay it on me.
well, is the Well, the reason that the systems, right, or the system, is in the position of power and influence, which it is in today's world, is because of the both physical and realistic power that it influences, and then also the economic power that it influences, right? And so the challenge that comes to mind is taking the example of someone that's working on the neurologist, right, that's working for Microsoft or Facebook or whoever, right, and kind of the machine that's operating there with the sole goal, in air quotes, to create higher revenue, right, and drive sales, and in theory at the expense of humanity, or one's humanity. And the the challenge that I think kind of automatically flows from that is I don't know if the question is the right term, but at least the concern, to put it politely or lightly, is that machine will continue to exist, right? And those people, again, this is abstract, right? But those people will continue to develop and amass money, and therefore power, and therefore influence, and which we've seen in, like, even to ground it, right, we've seen that in our elections, right? We're spending bajillions of dollars on ads, bajillions of dollars on all kinds of different influence, and we saw that with even outside outside entities getting involved, like Russia, right? um and and so how is stepping outside of that game actually setting you up for at least comparative power, and I think more substantively influence?
Yeah, no, I don't want to. Let me clarify. I'm not saying everyone needs to check out, right? I'd be a huge hypocrite if I were, because as I said, yeah, to take certain parts of my inclinations to another step is to conclude that I should go be like a farmer and have 10 kids or something in the middle of nowhere, which, hey, sounds really nice, and maybe someday, Lord willing. But no, I'm actually saying people need to kind of do that philosophically within their position, right? Recognize the structures that they're a part of, and then assert their humanity and take responsibility and authority for that, what they have. So I'm not saying stop being a manager. I'm saying recognize that you're a human being and you are making a choice and shaping yourself with every decision and management choice you make. And you're shaping the people under you, right? You have responsibility for their care too. So it isn't cease to participate. It's remember that it's a choice, right? Even just thinking about it and being like, I could quit and maybe I should, but here's why I could stay. And here's what I could do to do this job better, is a first step in just reasserting a degree of human responsibility in that position. And right, I mean, I think to then put the paradox in, the risk is obviously, of course, that you are deceiving yourself and that you are just being co-opted by the larger structure. But I think we do have freedom and therefore responsibility as human beings. And so the capacity to exercise that responsibility, if we think we can, right? If you think you have the discipline to wield it correctly, to put a really nerdy spin on it, but I think it's appropriate talking to you just because I know what we both grew up on. It's the difference between, I used this in a blog post recently too, so that's why it's top of mind. It's the difference between Sauron's ring and the Palantirs, right? The Seeing Stones of Arnor, the Northern Kingdom. Sauron's ring is necessarily corrupting. Boromir wants to wield it. Elrond is right when he says, no, sorry, not going to work. This is a weapon that is purely the enemy's weapon. His not just his power, but also his essence is in it. And therefore, it will overshadow you rather than you overshadowing it. The Palantirs are also corrupting for most people, right? They corrupt Saruman, who's incredibly powerful. They almost corrupt Pippin, but he's too good in heart in some sense, and too much of an unknown factor. And hobbits are hardier than people expect them to be. But the Palantirs are originally neutral tools. So this sort of warpedness is a thing put on them by Sauron, and they're waiting for Aragorn to wrestle them from the grasp of the Dark Lord. That as the heir of Isildur, he can reassert in the dawn of the Age of Men, right? The Age of Elves is over. The Age of Men has come. He can reassert human dignity, and not just human dignity, but authority, real, like true. It's a beautiful illustration of what authority is, and say like, no, I am master of these, even and over and against Sauron, who is like by some scales way more powerful than he is, right? Sauron is not the devil. This is the other thing. Is in the hierarchy of spiritual beings and in the Lord of the Rings, Sauron's just a lesser demon, actually, or a lieutenant to the devil, not the devil himself. So we can call him like Moloch or something, or Mammon in our own context. And so let's say that we are, suffering the dominion of Mammon. And there's a difference between Mammon's weapons and human weapons that Mammon is dominating. Mammon's tools and human tools. And so what I'm hoping and what we should all be working towards is that we can start recognizing the difference, and that the right people can exercise human authority over human tools and tear them from the grasp of Mammon or Moloch. Take your pick.
For those of you listening on Spotify or iTunes or wherever, I was smiling broadly and strongly throughout that entire, I don't know if allegory is quite the right term, but picture and comparison, because yes, Micah is right. I very much love all of that stuff. And it's funny you bring it up, because I'm actually with my sister, we read a book together and then we talk about it once a week, or one of my sisters. And the one we're currently reading is about Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and their friendship, and then the philosophies that they had and then changed over time and then congruously went into their works. And so it talks about all this stuff. And so okay. So here's my, I think, final question. We'll see. We're getting towards the end here, but aside from escaping into these wonderful realities that men such as Tolkien and Lewis and others have painted for us, aside from escaping into them, how does one, from your perspective, kind of maintain a positive outlook, right? Because I think it's very easy to, get caught up in a slightly more 1984 perspective, which is like the machine is here, Mammon is here, whatever it is, and there's not much you can do. This sucks. For the age before technology or whatever you want to come up with, right? Which is like,
Sure.
like I think in one way, an easy thing that people run to, which is like they forget, like, okay, before technology, like, life was, what is it? Nasty, brutish, and short. So, so I think there were some elements.
Excuse me, I'm gonna sneeze. But yeah, continue. No, exactly. No, good. Tickle.
Aside from like, I think it's easy to get caught up in that, right? And having a kind of a darker, more dank perspective on things. How do you, what are your thoughts about, like, how do you maintain positive, a positive mentality and a positive outlook on life to where you're still enjoying it? Because I feel like relative to our humanity, that is such a serious element of how we need to exist in order to exist fully, which is to say humanely.
Yeah. I guess 4 things in order. Church / God's word, friends, walks, and the gym. Actually, if I had to put the gym and walks in order, I'm not sure.
Depends on where you're going on a walk. If you're going
exactly,
to walk
yeah.
Sure.
So, the first thing is to be reminded that you are a sinner saved by grace, and that God is working in the world to do his will, and his Holy Spirit can be active in regenerating yourself and the world. So that's a message of hope that Christ is King and is coming again. The second is community, life in community, right? No human action is possible alone. What's a cord of three strands is not easily broken. And where one can go, two can go further, because if one should fall, the other can pick him up. So friendships and life in community are what allow us to both accomplish things, and just also we find ourselves in those. That so much of our self-conception is based on is rooted in our relationships. We are less ourselves when we are not in relationship. And then I think walks in nature are a wonderfully peaceful way to reacquaint yourself with your embodiedness and your place in the created order. And relatedly, the gym is a place to test yourself. And again, to reassert your embodiedness. I mean, that's a huge part of all of this, is that we're increasingly detached and we treat ourselves like the same kind of digital information that we're constantly manipulating all day, that like we reduce ourselves to sort of the mind space that we're spending online and forget that we're also an animal, and that corporeality shapes our reality, right? That so much of what we think of as being moods or states of mind are, of course, rooted in your gut biochemistry at that moment, or whether you had enough sleep the night before, or all sorts of things. There's a reason coffee is so nice. So that's just it. I think reasserting the fact that you are not a meat puppet being piloted by some sort of mind thing that could be uploaded into the cloud someday, but are in fact body and soul. That your central nervous system has like a bunch of endings in your gut, like this. So your brain, mind, soul, stomach. To go back to C.S. Lewis, you have a head, chest, and stomach, right? And we live in an age of men without chests, as he said in The Abolition of Man. But we should strive to be fully integrated, holistic, human beings, healthy human beings, which means we have all three and are aware of them, and that the chest can mediate between the body's needs and the aspirations of the mind, so that there be a kind of discipline. All of this, everything I've talked about takes the cultivation of discipline, and one of the easiest ways to take that first step is just working out.
I like that. In as I was sitting and obviously listening and thinking about what we've been talking about, one of the thoughts that came to mind was, I feel like the first bit of the podcast, this is just me kind of reflecting back, but first bit of the podcast was it felt slower and more methodical, right? And then we started talking about some of the various elements and aspects towards the last half, or like however long it's been, and it like picked up, and there was like more to it, and there was more aspiration of thought there. And I was thinking, the thought that came to mind is, I think it's easy for people in this journey, which is to tie it back to us all being on a journey. I think it's easy for all of us to kind of look back at the kind of the elements of our past, or how we got here, and treat them as kind of methodical, or treat them as relatively not boring or mundane, but kind of plodding, so to speak. And it's like, oh, now what I'm doing is exciting and interesting, or oh, if only until I can reach tomorrow's job or the next job, that'll be engaging, interesting. And I think it's so important to reflect on those past elements and to understand them about others, because I think that's what sets you up to then comprehend and understand where people are at today and where you yourself are at today. So I just want to throw that out there as I was thinking about that, as I hope people are in your field and my field and people listening are like taking that time to reflect positively and then substantively about what I think can easily feel like something that doesn't matter. And I think that comes to mind because one of the things talked about in the book that I'm reading about C.S. Lewis and Tolkien and whatnot is they talk about how quickly we are as a society, as a function of our society, going back even to their time, right? Is we throw out the previous educational and or time periods of our existence and we focus on as if like only what we know today is like, oh, this is the truth, right? Even though if you back it up, a generation, what we have now thrown out the window was considered the truth today. And it's like, why would you assume that the next generation of thought won't throw out what you've considered hardcore belief in science and whatever else it is as of today? And so that's why I feel like it's important to reflect on kind of the whole journey, which then sets you up to kind of have the continued positive conversations. So thank you for all that. Thank you for coming on. It was interesting. I enjoyed it. I wasn't totally sure where the back half would go. Obviously, I knew most of the front half, but I was excited. It was interesting and engaging. So thank you for
Thanks for having me on. No, it was fun.
All right. I will catch you all next time. Thank you for listening. And don't forget to like and subscribe and leave a review. We will talk to you soon.